are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is a solved one about the Wolfman Killer. Now this case asks the question, how easy is it to cover up a killer when they have a connection to the people investigating the case? Just how far will investigators go to cover up dozens of murders in order to help themselves? By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leaving a nice comment down below. Also want to remind you, it is ODDtober, where I'm posting the spookiest, strangest stories that I can find, all regarding true crime still, and they will be posted every Thursday and Sunday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. So make sure you are subscribed and coming back those times. Now, I also want to thank today's sponsor, which is ExpressVPN. Now, protection is something that I am always trying to, make myself knowledgeable on, but also share that information with you guys. And I think online security is often just as important as, in-person security or just, home security and stuff like that. We don't think of how much danger can be online. So if you don't know, a VPN is actually a virtual private network that I love how they explain it. It's like a tunnel between your device and the internet, so there's no way that other people can get in. There's actually so much more that you're allowed to do when you have a VPN though, and it's kind of like a little secret I didn't know about. But basically, when you have a VPN, you can use the internet from anywhere in the world while you're still at home. And you might be thinking, why does this matter? But this means that on sites like Netflix, Hulu, Prime Video, all of those streaming services, when you are in the country that you're in, you only see what that country's Netflix looks like. However, the UK's Netflix looks completely different. So you can actually, with one click of a button, make it seem like you're in the UK and suddenly get a whole different page full of movies and TV shows. And right now, I know that I've gone through so many movies and TV shows that I needed more to watch. And this was just another thing that made me feel like ExpressVPN was worth it. If you would like to try it out, you can get 3 months free by clicking the link in my description box. It is expressvpn.com/McKenna. And if you didn't know, I'm also releasing merch this month. It really seems like you guys are loving this merch too, and I cannot wait to see you guys in them. If you want to get some of your own, there will be a link in the description. And thank you for ExpressVPN for sponsoring this portion of the video. Now let's get back to this story. So it was 1918 in Germany, and a 17-year-old named Friedel Roth had actually just run away from home. He had run to Hanover, which is where some of his friends lived, so he was staying with them for a while to just get away from his house. However, on September 25th, he would leave and he would not return to his friend's house. Yet this wasn't really a huge mystery as to where Friedel had gone for this case, because his father had come to look for him at his friend's house, and they immediately said, oh, well, he's just with one of his friends. A man came and they left together, and that's where he must be. These friends even had a name for this man. His name was Fritz Haarman, and he lived in a single-room apartment at 27 Sellerstrabe. So Friedel's father took this information and went to the police, hoping that they would go and at least search this man's apartment or question him as to where this man's son was. So he did this, and the police really didn't seem to be in a rush to do anything to help find this missing boy. Friedel's father was a pretty persuasive guy though, and after a month of begging investigators to do something with his son still not coming home, investigators finally did knock on this apartment door. Fritz opened the door, and what they found inside was the presence of a boy, but this was not Friedel. This was actually a 13-year-old who was partially naked on Fritz's bed. He appeared to be very afraid as well as beaten. Fritz was immediately taken into custody for the sexual assault of a minor, and his apartment was searched this time to see if they could also find any evidence as to where Friedel had gone and if he had anything to do with his disappearance. They didn't find anything inside this apartment, but Fritz was charged with the trauma of this 13-year-old boy who he sexually assaulted and sentenced to 9 months in jail. He wouldn't immediately be serving this though. He actually ran for a while, and it would be 2 years later, when it was 1920, that he would finally be caught and put into this prison. He was behind bars for this crime between March and December of that year. But 3 years later, a murderer would be roaming the streets. It was February 12th of 1923 when a 17-year-old was riding the train to the Hanover train station. This is when he would disappear. His name was Fritz Franke, and he was a wonderful pianist who was so prepared for life and was really trying to become the man that he wanted to be, and he had his life taken from him. A month later, it was March 20th, and another boy would go missing. He was also 17 and named Wilhelm Schultz. Now, Wilhelm was actually going to work on this train, and he vanished. None of these victims were being found anywhere either. They were continuously just being missing and put on missing persons posters, but none of their bodies were being located. They simply never made it home, and no one could even guess what had happened to them, but they knew in their worst nightmares that there was a possibility that they were murdered. 2 months later, a 16-year-old would tell his friend that he was running away from home to join the Marines. This was Roland Hutch, and on May 23rd, he would vanish, and his friend thought he was joining the Marines, but he actually never showed up there and never was a part of the Marines at all. He was just gone. Little did investigators know how close they were to catching a killer when they arrested Fritz Haarman. But when he finished his sentence, they let him go, and now the murders were ramping up. You see, the first victim we discussed, Friedel Roth, the one who was staying with friends and whose friends told the police that he was with Fritz Haarman, well, they didn't find Friedel in Fritz's apartment because he had already hidden him. Well, not all of him. You see, Friedel's severed head was behind the stove in his apartment, wrapped in newspaper. But since investigators were looking for a whole body, they didn't believe a whole body could fit inside of a stove or behind it. And because no one found Friedel's head that day, no one thought that Fritz was a killer. Just a horrible human sexually assaulting a minor. So a killer was free to roam, and the murders would continue. On June 25th, a month after the last disappearance, another boy would vanish. This was Ernest Etherberg, and he was 13 and went to do errands for his father and never returned. Then it was 2 months later, an 18-year-old named Henrik Strube lived with his aunt, worked as a office clerk, and he was trying to get his life in order. He was trying to be an adult at just 18 years old, but he was then reported missing and never found when they searched for him. A month after this, Paul Bronskiwi was headed home from a summer job, and he took the train, but he didn't make it home as a 17-year-old to his family. That same month, on September 30th, a man named Richard Graff, who was only 17 years old, was headed home to his family from the Hanover train station as well, but he actually made a phone call there to his family where he said he had met someone who had a good job for him, where he was going to make some money. But he never called them again. The disappearances then seemed to be happening even more frequently, and it would only be 2 weeks later that another boy would vanish. William Erdner, who was 16, didn't come home from work. But this would be the first time that investigators actually had a suspect. You see, Wilhelm's parents claimed that he had been wanting to go to the traveling carnival that was in town, and he was actually going to go with someone that he recently met. This was a man who was a grown man, an adult man named Fritz Haarman, who was also a detective. Now, investigators were thrilled to possibly have a name to put to this killer until they realized that the parents were saying he was a detective, and there was no detective under that name. They knew that this man was possibly identifying himself under an alias, and this of course wouldn't help them find anything but dead ends. That same month, 2 more victims would vanish, and these were both at the Hanover train station. One was 15 and one was 13. So it was Herman Wolf that happened on October 24th and Heinz Brinkman on October 27th. But the next month, on November 10th, not that long after, Adolf Hannepel also disappeared there while he was 17 years old. Many witnesses claim that Adolf was sitting on his trunk in the waiting room waiting for his train when he was approached by 2 adult men who then walked with him to a cafe nearby. It didn't seem like he was struggling or he was being forced to, so nobody involved themselves in this, but now he was missing. It seemed as though a stakeout was needed at Hanover train station. However, this would not occur, at least not yet. It was speculated that this was because investigators knew who the person that they needed to bring in was and didn't want to do it yet. Why? Well, that's a reason that we will discuss later on. But for now, we need to go back to the victims. That December 6th, Adolf Hennes was looking for a job as a 19-year-old when he vanished as well and never made it home. The next year, the murders didn't miraculously halt either. On January 5th, it was Ernest Spickier, who was 17, and then 10 days later, Henrik Koch, who was 20. In February, it was Will Singer, who was 19, who was said to be traveling with a friend before he vanished, and nobody knew who this friend was. And then it was Herman Speckert, who was 16. Now, the community was horrified, and the investigators seemed to be doing everything that they could to the public because the public didn't know anything about the investigation. There were so many rumors and speculation about what was happening, but nobody knew the extent of what was going on, except for the fact that there were piles and piles of missing persons posters that were being added to walls and newspapers, so they weren't completely ignorant to that fact. It also didn't help that the newspapers were reporting higher numbers of missing persons than there actually were. So, of course, the community was in a panic when investigators weren't really saying or doing anything. By April, 3 more victims were gone. This was Herman Bach, Alfred Hogriff, and Wilhelm Apel, 2 of which were said to be headed to the Hanover train station as well. Now, the last victim this month was a man named Robert Witzel, and he would be a huge part of this entire investigation. He told his mother that he wanted to visit a traveling circus, and he got some money from his mother and then told her that he was going with an official from the railway station. So she felt kind of safe with her son going with this person because he was older and an official. This other person was not found at the time. They didn't know who it was. They didn't know his name. Now, this entire case, is a bit different than the others that we usually cover, if you haven't figured that out. And that is the fact that most of these victims were male. In fact, all of them were. And it is more common that serial killers will go after females. Although it's not unheard of that males will be attacked too, it normally isn't the actual MO of the serial killer to go after males. These murders weren't stopping there either. There was a man named Heinz Martin who was taken from the Hanover station once again. Then there was a traveling salesman named Fritz Wittig. Then Frederick Albing, who was only 10 and the youngest victim thus far. But this month was a little bit different than the rest, and that was because on May 17th, bodies would begin to be found. Well, pieces of bodies, that is. This was near the Leine River that was in Hanover, and 2 children were actually playing near the shore, and they uncovered a human skull. When it was brought in to be examined, it was found to belong to a young male between 18 to 20 years old. This matched the exact victim profile of all of the disappearances happening in the area, and they believed that they were finally stumbling upon the bodies. However, investigators also theorized that possibly it wasn't from a murder, but from grave robbers or from medical students playing a prank, and that it really had nothing to do with the disappearances at all. However, that was hard to believe when 2 weeks later another skull would be found, and this was nearby to where the first one was found and also belonged to a young male between 18 to 20 years old. Then another boy would vanish. This was 16-year-old Frederick Koch, and he was walking to college on June 5th with some friends when he just disappeared and didn't make it to class. And his friends actually said that they had been walking with him when an older male came up behind him, kind of tapped him on the boot with his walking stick and said, "Well, boy, don't you recognize me?" It's unknown if Frederick knew this man that asked him that question or acknowledged him, but his friends did go ahead and went off to class, and they never saw him again. 8 days later, on June 13th, 2 more skulls would be found, one in each of the locations that skulls had been found in before. These were skulls that were said to have been there quite a while, and they hadn't just been placed. But this was examined to be a skull of a male in his late teens, so a little bit younger than the skulls prior. The other boy was actually a boy from 11 to 13 years old, so much younger. It was found that both of their heads had been removed by a sharp instrument, and one had also been scalped. A sack of bones was then discovered in a field nearby close to a village, and these belonged to many different victims. The next day, on June 14th, a 17-year-old named Eric Chivrais, he was at the Hanover station, and I'm sure you can guess what occurred next. But that same exact day, the community nor investigators could have predicted what they would find next, and this actually had nothing to do with Eric and his case, but this had to do with many, many skulls being found in the Lenai River. That same river that they'd been found in prior, or found next to prior. You see, investigators had decided to have an extensive search in and around the water. They drug the water, and by the end of the search, 500 body parts were found. Or bones, I should say. At this point, they were taken to medical examiners who said that they belonged to at least 22 victims. This was still the exact victim profile that they had been searching for with all of these missing boys. At this point, no one could hide the truth. There was a serial killer among them. The killer was being dubbed the Butcher of Hanover, the Wolf Man, the Vampire of Hanover, and upon looking at these bodies, they were about to discover just how much these victims had gone through. The main suspect was actually quickly brought forward by members of the community who heard all of this happening and realized that there was a man they believed could match someone who would do this to all of these boys. However, the Hanover police, the ones supposed to be in charge of this case, they were deemed unfit to investigate this man. In fact, 2 detectives from Berlin were brought in to take over this investigation in Hanover. This main suspect was placed under surveillance by these Berlin officers who were watching his every move and following him around starting on June 18th. 4 days later, they would catch him talking to a young boy at Hanover train station, and they would get into an argument. These Berlin officers then began to prepare themselves to save this boy from being murdered by this man when he actually went and talked to officers. Their main suspect was talking to police officers at the station, not Berlin officers because they were undercover and not wearing uniforms, but the actual Hanover police that frequented this train station. This main suspect went over to them and began talking to them. He then began to say that the man that he was talking to, or the boy he was talking to, had forged documents that he was using to travel, and that he needed to be arrested. So not knowing what else to do, these Hanover officers actually did arrest this young boy so they could bring him into safety, because they didn't have any evidence against this main suspect at the time that he was going to do anything bad or that he ever had done anything bad. So they brought in the boy and not the suspect. And they interrogated this boy upon bringing him into the police department. His name was Karl Fromm, and he was 15 years old. Carl immediately began talking, and he had a story of his own. He claimed that he had actually been living with the main suspect and the man who had been talking to him at the train station, and he had actually sexually assaulted him multiple times while he was living with him, and often held a knife to his throat while doing so. Now, because of this statement, Berlin officers were then able to arrest their suspect because they had a crime that he committed: sexual assault. This was in fact Fritz Haarman, and when he was brought in, he was being charged with sexual assault, but they hoped that they could get him to confess or find other evidence to connect him to the murders. While they booked him, they sent officers to search his apartment as well. His whole place actually appeared like a crime scene itself. There was blood all over the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and his bedding. And Fritz's excuse for the blood was that he sold meat out of his home, which caused the blood. That's when investigators began to talk to his neighbors around his apartment, and one was his landlady named Elizabeth, and she claimed that Fritz was always giving her men's clothes and items to have, and of course she took it because it was a nice thing for him to give her and she could use them. But because of this, investigators believed that Fritz was keeping some of his victims' clothing as the trophies that serial killers often have. So they began to search his own apartment to see if they could find any of the victims' clothing still inside. And with all of the clothing that they discovered, they decided to put it on display at the Hanover Police Department and ask victims' families or, missing persons' families to come in and see if they could identify their loved ones' clothing. And after this, they ended up finding Hans Sonnenfeld's yellow overcoat, Ernest Etherberg's school cap and braces, Paul Bruneskew's jacket, knapsack, trousers, and towel. And this wasn't all either. You see, Herman Bach's clothing was found inside of his apartment, and the landlady had this man's suitcase. Heinz Martin's clothing was found, as well as a leather bag from Friedrich Koch. There were multiple pieces of victims' clothing, boys who had disappeared, in Fritz's apartment. Fritz's neighbors also claimed that they often saw teenage boys going into his apartment all the time. But the most concerning part, if that wasn't disgusting enough, was that they never saw them leaving. They only saw Fritz leaving with sacks, bags, or baskets in his possession. He was always leaving late evening, early morning, in the dark. Now, hearing that Fritz was in custody, some of his former neighbors came forward to investigators saying that they had actually been so suspicious that they went to follow him one night. And they watched him walk all the way to the river, the same river where the bodies were found, and they watched him throw a sack into that river. Even with all of this evidence, Fritz was saying that he had gotten this clothing through trades or when the boys would come over and be with him, and that he didn't murder them and he didn't steal their clothes. He just had them there. And of course, this could throw a wrench in the investigation if he still wasn't confessing. But then Robert Witzel's clothes were identified among the ones found in Fritz's apartment. And they knew they had a possible witness to connect Fritz to his murder, to being the last person with Robert, without a doubt. Because Robert, if you remember, was the victim that wanted to go to the traveling carnival and was going with someone he claimed to be a friend who was also an officer or a worker for the railway. Nobody had seen him that day with that person, but the day prior, Robert was with a man, a grown man, and his friend had seen him with that man. And this man was dressed as a police officer. Now you may be thinking, how does this prove anything? A man dressed as a police officer when Fritz wasn't an officer. So how would they connect that back to him? Well, do you remember how I told you that the Hanover police never really wanted to catch him? That they kept putting it off? Well, there was a reason for that. To explain, though, I will have to take you back through Fritz's life so we understand what got him to this point. You see, Fritz Hendrik Karl Haarman, or Fritz, was born on October 25th, 1879. He was the baby of the family. He had 6 siblings, and he was known to be quite a quiet child. He didn't have any friends. This was mainly said to be because he didn't enjoy doing the normal boy things. He liked playing dolls with his sisters and dressing up in their clothes, and that's where he felt most like himself. His parents actually really supported this. His mother often taught him how to knit and how to cook and how to do things around the house that he enjoyed. So he really got to be who he wanted to be, but some of the boys at school didn't want to do those things, and so he often didn't make very many friends. His mother was actually the wealthy parent of the 2, and his father was said to marry her and have children with her because of that and only that. And so this caused him to not be home often, and he would often have affairs, and he would treat his wife horribly, but they would stay together. Fritz was said to be a good student in school. He got good grades, but he was often said to daydream quite a bit, and this caused him to be held back a few grades. Now, it was said that he was actually sexually assaulted by a teacher during this time, but nobody knows much information because Fritz won't talk about it. Now, Fritz did do well enough to graduate school, and he went on to become a locksmith, but while doing that, he realized that's not what he wanted to do, and he went and he joined the military. This would go well at first until he started to have lapses of consciousness, and it was later believed that this was epilepsy. But at this point, he was discharged and he went to work for his father. He was only 16 by this point, and when he returned back in Hanover, this is where he began to sexually assault young boys. And he was arrested for this, placed into a mental institution, and certified incurably deranged. This meant he was unfit to stand trial, and he was to stay in this institution until decided later on if he could be released, if he was capable of that. However, 7 months later, he was out, and this wasn't because he was released early. Fritz had escaped. His mother had helped him flee to Switzerland, and this is where he got a job in a shipyard and hid out. A little over a year later, he headed back to Hanover, and this is where he got engaged and had a baby on the way. He was also being told that he had to go back into the military and perform the rest of his service. So for that next year, he was known as a great soldier. He was an excellent marksman, and then he began passing out again, and he was dismissed. He got a job back in Hanover, began to work for his father again. However, he then filed a maintenance lawsuit against his own father, saying that he couldn't work because of what had happened to him in the military and how he kept passing out. The charges were dropped because his father fought back, and then next year their relationship got even worse. His father was then trying to sue Fritz because he was sending him death threats and using blackmail against him, and his father wanted Fritz put back into the mental institution where he escaped from because he never had to go back. So Fritz was given a psychiatric evaluation and he was deemed mentally unstable. But he was not put back into an institution at this time, and he and his fiancée began selling raw fish to make money. But it wasn't long after that his fiancée ended their engagement and told him to move out. She did this because she believed he was having an affair with a student and didn't want anything to do with him. Now, this was in 1904, and the first murder occurred in 1918. So what happened in the next 14 years that led him to becoming a serial killer? He needed a new job, and instead of getting a legal one, he decided to become a con man. He began to steal, and he was going and stealing tombstones and from graves. And between 1905 and 1912, he was actually in jail for this, for larceny, embezzlement, and assault. And that was just off and on. It wasn't that entire time, so he would get out, he would steal again, he would be put back in jail. But in 2013, he was sentenced to 5 years for fraud and burglary. So, in April of 2018, he was released. And of course, we know just a few months later the murders would occur. But during those few months, Fritz Haarman himself would begin to work for the police in Hanover. He wasn't just an officer though, he was actually a police informant. Due to his contacts as a criminal himself, he could help them out in many different ways. He had gone right back to his old ways as soon as he was released, and the police knew that he was going to do this. However, they wanted to use that to their advantage this time. They were also said to know that he was a gay man, which was illegal in Germany at the time, and as horrible as it is that being gay was illegal, it was also the reason why police told no one that he was working for them. Fritz was told to patrol the Hanover train station at all times to give details on criminal networks in the area. Fritz was told to become a fence for stolen property, which basically means that it's someone who takes the stolen goods out of the con man's arms and sells it under the table for them so they're not caught. But he was so good at this because he had done it before. This is something that he often did. So when these criminals would bring the stolen goods to him, he would contact the police secretly and they would come raid his home and end up arresting the person who brought the stolen goods, the criminal, and also arresting Fritz just to keep his image up, to make it look like he wasn't this rat or this police informant that he was being arrested too. It was said that Fritz kind of had this god complex about him. When he was a police informant, he believed that he was a member of the police, and he would often perform citizens' arrest for forged documents at the train station for individuals who weren't supposed to be using those documents, and he liked the power that he had and he used it, but he didn't actually have that power. He just thought he did. So in September of that same year, when Fritz began to murder and people were pointing fingers at him, police didn't want to investigate him because he was doing something that they couldn't do. He was solving a lot of cases that needed help from a criminal who knew how to do it and how these other criminals were doing it. He was technically putting other criminals in custody for them, so they didn't want to lose their asset. But when the 13-year-old was found in his bed, a month after they were supposed to be looking into him, they had to convict him. And so in 1923, after he had served his sentence and was released, when more murders occurred all surrounding the Hanover train station, which should have connected investigators to Fritz, they did nothing. Now, I'm unsure if he was still a police informant after he got out of jail at that time in 1923, or if he just went on to do his own thing after that. But when the Berlin police came into town, they were not putting up with any of that and immediately brought him into custody. Fritz was not wanting to say anything, but his sister was brought in, where she begged him to confess to the murders. And he did. Fritz claimed that there were around 30 to 40 victims, but he didn't know exactly how many. However, he also said it could be between 50 and 70. He said why he killed was a mystery to him, and he claimed that he wasn't alone in doing so. Fritz also said that he met a 19-year-old named Hans Grans who was selling clothes at the Hanover station and was basically, homeless and didn't have any food or anywhere to stay. And so they began to stay together a year after the first murder occurred. Fritz claimed that he thought of Hans as a son and was pulling him out of the ditch to make sure he didn't go to the dogs. It was said that Hans and Fritz had quite a toxic relationship. Fritz would throw him out of the apartment all of the time and then beg him to come back, and Hans would make fun of him and manipulate him, and Fritz said that he put up with it because he wanted someone that he meant everything to. Although Hans claimed that this was not a sexual relationship or a romantic relationship at all. With the second victim, after 5 years of no murders, Fritz and Hans began to invite young men over. During one of these nights, Hans actually left with some friends and left Fritz with this boy. And when he came back, the boy was gone and Fritz said that he had left. However, Hans left and came back a little while later, and this boy was lying naked, deceased on Fritz's bed. Hans just asked him if he should come back later, and then he left again. Fritz said that he would take these boys back to his apartment, he would give him something to eat and drink, he would then sexually assault them, and that's when he would give them what he called a love bite, where he bit into their Adam's apple until they suffocated to death. He said this was in a rabid sexual passion and that he would collapse on top of their body. But this is why Fritz was being referred to as the Wolf Man. He said they would then be dismembered, which he hated doing the most, and then he would throw them into the river. He went through the process with investigators of the dismemberment, saying that he poured himself a strong black coffee before lying the victims down, covering their face with a cloth and removing body parts. He would remove intestines, heart, lungs, kidney, and they were all placed in a bucket, and then he severed the legs, the arms, the head, and then he smashed the skull to pieces. He claimed that all of the skulls that were in one piece that were found were not victims of his because he always smashed them, besides the first victim and the last. He and Hans would then sell the victims' personal belongings to the black market, other than the pieces that they kept. However, some said that this wasn't all that he did to his victims. There was speculation that he ate their flesh and sold the meat on their bodies as ground meat, saying it was pork or horse. They said that he would say to them when he sold it to them that he got it from a butcher named Carl. And there was even a neighbor of his who said that they ate the meat that he sold to them and they were sick for a week. Fritz denied that, and he also said there was only one victim that he knew of that survived, and that they got away after he bit them, but they never reported the attack, so he doesn't know, and the investigators don't know if this person survived. It was also said by Fritz that lots of missing persons weren't reported missing immediately after they went missing, because Fritz was said to know their families or to get to know their families because they lived nearby, and he would tell them that they would come back, that it was pointless to report them missing because they would be back in no time. And of course, because he was so used to pretending to be a police officer, I'm sure that he used these tactics to talk these families out of going to the actual police because they believed he was an officer. By the end of the investigation, investigators could charge Fritz with 27 murders. Fritz claimed that he only killed some of them because Hans actually wanted them dead. At this point, Hans was also arrested and charged with accessory to murder. The strange thing was that for this trial, nobody went into it thinking that it was a trial for a serial killer, because that term wasn't yet a thing. They were calling this man a monster, a vampire, a werewolf, but not a serial killer. He was being charged with 14 murders, and he pled guilty to all of them, but he said that they weren't premeditated. And Hans, who was also being tried, pled not guilty. Now, Fritz had also been examined and found competent to stand trial, even though he had previously been deemed mentally unstable. During the trial, Fritz was completely dismissive to everyone. He smoked cigars, he insulted people, he wouldn't give any information. He was shown victims' pictures to confirm that they were his victims, and he would shrug his shoulders, say that they could charge him with it. When he was shown one boy, he even said that he wouldn't want anything to do with a boy as ugly as that, and he said that to the boy's father. Over 200 witnesses were brought in to testify against him, one of which said that they believed they saw a human mouth boiling in a soup kettle in Fritz's apartment, and they had taken this to the Hanover police to show them what they found, and the police said, it's simply a pig snout, that's all it is, and didn't do anything about it. Many witnesses said at the train station they had seen Hans and Fritz together, and Hans would point to the victims and then Fritz would go up to them, kind of telling Fritz who to choose next. Fritz then said, "Condemn me to death. I ask only for justice. I am not mad. Make it short, make it soon. Deliver me from this life which is torment. I will not petition for mercy, nor will I appeal. I want to pass just one more merry night in my cell with coffee, cheese, and cigars, after which I will curse my father and go to my execution as if it were my wedding." Hearing all of this, Fritz was sentenced to beheading, while Hans was sentenced to life and 12 years. Fritz stood when this sentence was given and said, "I accept the verdict fully and freely. I shall go to the decapitating block joyfully and happily," whereas Hans began crying and collapsed in his cell. Fritz didn't even try to appeal, yet Hans did and was denied. Fritz said that if he was released, he would kill again. On April 15th, 1925, Fritz was beheaded, with his final meal being a cigar and Brazilian coffee. It was said that he was pale and nervous, and his last words were, "I am guilty, gentlemen, but hard though it may be, I want to die as a man. I repent, but I do not fear death." However, this would not be the end of Fritz Haarman. You see, his head was then preserved in formaldehyde and brought to medical schools to be able to experiment on him. It was unknown what they really did with this besides examining the structure of his brain, but the image of his head in this block is more like a horror movie than reality, but this really is what they did with his head. I really wish that they would have done more experiments or released what they had done with his head, because I feel like, you possibly could get to know more about serial killers by they do what they do, nature versus nurture, by studying one. I'm not sure you could do much when the head's in a block like that. So yeah, I just think it's very creepy and eerie. But in 2014, this head of his had been in storage for a while, and the medical school actually decided to have it cremated, so it's no longer a thing. But his accomplice, Hans, he died of old age in 1975. But I'd love to know what you think, because I think that what you guys come up with is very incredible. Your minds work in mysterious ways. That sounds so cheesy, but y'all think so differently. So it's nice to know your different opinions on why people do what they do. But do you think Hans had more to do with it than he was charged with? Do you think that he had more to do with the killings? I don't have a doubt that Fritz was the mastermind here and did most of the killings, but I do think maybe Hans had a little more to do with it than he wanted to say. But would he have if Fritz hadn't have taken him off the streets and brought him into his home? Maybe he felt like he was forced to do that to have a home. I do think that this case is a definite cover-up by investigators. It is at least a botched investigation, and that they really did want to save their asset, even if he was a killer, which I feel like that kind of cancels out, he's putting all of these criminals in jail. Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. But when he's murdering people, I feel like, you have to kind of weigh the consequences, and he should have been put away for killing people over just putting criminals in jail. But that's just me. Apparently they didn't feel the same. I hope you are enjoying ODDtober, and don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.